One of your key prongs, of course, on the economic side is to reindustrialize America. And, one of the things that I guess for the longest time you haven't been allowed to talk to in this town is industrial policy. It's almost like a bad word or something, right? But actually, you're arguing for industrial policy, aren't you?
Well, I think that concept has changed a bit. I mean, certainly in the last 12 to 18 months, I think it's getting a different read. And, the CHIPS and Science Act was something that was supported by many, many business leaders and, financial leaders to a certain extent. And that is, just one element, I mean, just one sector in what's actually a much broader, set of industries where we're going to need to supplement that through U.S. investment for the sake of long-term economic and security interests. And the problem set is pretty clear. I mean, when one realizes the vulnerabilities of that particular supply chain, it's going to need to be redesigned. And that's, as we can see, a public-private partnership. I mean, during COVID, Operation Warp Speed was public-private. And, we actually, and I think the thing here is what everyone wants to call it, industrial strategy, industrial policy. I mean, the way I see it just as a historian is most of our history and our innovation and our economic prosperity is, more complicated than that. I mean, we have a thriving, innovative private sector, and I think we always, that is, so much of what our power is about. And at the same time, the history of government research and development and science and technology. I mean, our national laboratories, our, major achievements, including the space race and, the fact that the iPhone is many of its technological antecedents were designed or imagined in DARPA. I mean, these sorts of things. I mean, we actually have a very collaborative system that does utilize some of the long-term strategic thinking of government. I mean, it can't be left entirely to how the private sector's incentive structure is designed. I mean, somewhere in here, we need to be capable of long-term strategic thinking that's for the sake of the national interest, and that includes economic power. And at the same time, the fact that we can draw upon and really empower a thriving private sector where there's an enormous amount of commercialization, obviously, and innovation and research and development of its own. I mean, that is the sort of system that won the Cold War. And I think it's the system that will prevail in this contest too, but only if we're able to successfully bifurcate to the point that we don't simply become the innovation arm of a Chinese economy that can, mass produce, sell it back to us, sell it into global markets, and put us out of business. That's really, I think, what we need to be concerned about in the long term. I mean, they have a clear strategy for winning an economic competition, and a lot of it actually does rely on engagement with the United States.
Well, this makes me think back now to the American idea. If we are behind the American idea as a society, and I think you argue that we must be, right, in order for this to work, right, then public-private partnership makes sense, for example. Then this common sense of purpose makes sense. And you were kind of alluding to there needing to be some kind of tipping point, something like a Pearl Harbor, right, where suddenly people think, oh, we need to do something. And there's a kind of a broader societal understanding around a common goal, as opposed to this, you use the term bifurcation. At the moment, there's a bit of a bifurcation of ideas, even, right? And because these things, public-private partnership can also be a force for bad, right? As it was, say, in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and in Italy and so forth, right? So I love this. I love your focus on the needing to kind of connect around the American idea, once again, and how that's viewed from the outside, because some of us have almost forgotten a little bit about what that is here.
Sure, and I'm hoping we don't need a Pearl Harbor. I mean, that's why I wrote this book, and China's Vision of Victory is to, hopefully ahead of any real catastrophe, we're able to think and act and make strategy and do long-term strategy, and we've been capable of...
Just to be clear, by Pearl Harbor, I mean like some sort of a tipping point that suddenly catalyzes people to realize, oh, actually we do have this shared purpose. Oh, there is something terrible happening over there we need to deal with.
Well, sure, to realize that we're in a contest that is, a lot of the 21st century will depend on this, and that the United States is the principal actor in this. I mean, we're going to have to lead the response to the People's Republic of China. And the American idea, which I still find such a compelling thought, and the fact that the American dream and all of that is, I think, intimately linked with the free world and these, sets of values that really free countries across the world can can relate to and can come together around. I mean, I do think the United States is going to have to find a working sense of self in the 21st century that allows us to deal with very hard things, with things that are outside of our borders and on which the outcome for us and for the broader world very much depends on our ability to handle things of that scale. So being able to come together around this issue, I mean, I think it is so far a unifying issue. I mean, you see that in Congress with the establishment of the House Select Committee on China. I mean, the fact that there are leaders from both parties coming together, working very closely, I think working in a very collaborative and professional way on this issue. I mean, that's sort of a rare moment in the United States. But the fact that this is so comprehensive and the fact that it does involve so many aspects, if not every aspect, of American and allied power, means that we are going to have a national consensus on this issue. And so hopefully we'll move out of the sort of discussion and sort of admiring the problem phase and get into the action phase. And that's certainly why I wrote the new book, to show us basically, insofar when we're ready to start to deal with this comprehensive challenge posed by the People's Republic of China. This is the direction we want to go in. We have to, succeed in these arenas. We have to basically get these things done, and that's how we preserve our advantages, hold our position, and ultimately position ourselves to overcome this challenge. So I think we're still in a very early stage of an American awakening on this issue, and certainly across the alliance system outside of governments. Many other countries are going to have to awaken to this too, and that's there are different levels of that in different regions of the world. I mean, certainly in Asia, there's a much keener sense of what the problem is than we might see if we were in Europe, let's say. But American leadership is going to be very important to bringing the world together around this, to bringing our global alliance system, which includes very diverse allies from Europe to Asia and also in between, to start to have a shared sense in terms of how we're going to handle this. And also to utilize the resources of the global alliance system to manage this problem.
Before I go into the diplomacy piece, which you're, kind of bringing us into naturally here, I'll just mention that you made a point of including the Bill of Rights in the book, right? Which I thought was really interesting, because that's part of the American idea, isn't it? Like a core part. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that was I was really thrilled, honestly, that. That's a good publisher that won't push back on you, including the entire Bill of Rights in your book. And I just thought, as somebody that's trained on fundamental documents, and that's how I did my PhD work on China-India relations and all that. I mean, when it was time to really get into the question of what's at stake, on one hand, I'm very familiar with the Communist Party documents where they tell us what they think is dangerous about the West, but then our own documents are so strong in terms of setting us up for what really counts here. I mean, the basic rights and values and protections here, the history that we have of reflecting on our own role in the world, I think coming to an understanding that what we have here is special, it is unique, it is well worth defending, and it's something that is fundamentally good. I think we will have to see that America is good in order to deal with what's coming in the 21st century. And however we arrive upon that, it may be one of the most important things. I mean, leaving aside economics and diplomacy and military, I mean, just the fundamental sense that this country is a force for good, I think is going to be an important realization for us. I mean, it's part of what got us through the hard stuff in the past, and I think we're going to have to rediscover that.
Well, and just to your point, again, you describe what things looked like in the 1930s, and there was a lot of the biggest American corporations were deeply involved with the German regime at the time, right? And
yeah, and if we go back to the corporate side, I mean, it's true. I mean, that too is not a unique moment. I mean, prior to the Second World War, I mean, American companies were deeply embedded in the Axis and transferring important technologies and helping, in Europe, helping the Nazis reindustrialize. I mean, these were horrific things, but they were at a far smaller scale than we are today. So I think that's one of the things we have to learn from our own history, is that when you go out against your values, there will be consequences. Business does have geopolitical consequences, and we've been there before, and I think we're there today where some of the worst legacies from American corporations in the Axis powers of the Second World War, I mean, there's very similar legacies are being built today in the People's Republic of China. And I think if I were a business leader, I would care about that, and I'd be willing to lead on that issue. I think that's very important that we have, some number of business leaders who are willing to say, look, there's a moral cost to what we're doing. There is value to taking the right side when the geopolitical stakes matter. And we know that our work matters to American power and prosperity, and this is how we'll lead. I mean, it would be great for us to start seeing that moment. We haven't seen it yet, but we will have to in order to get through this all.
Well, and also I think the lesson is that it's possible to be so deeply connected and involved and committed and pull back and take a completely different track rather quickly. I mean, I find that actually kind of inspiring, that we have a historical precedent for that.
Right, and before our companies became the arsenal of democracy in the Second World War, they were, some of them, very famous, well-known companies were up to their necks in the Axis powers. So they did the wrong thing until they did the right thing, but ultimately they did the right thing, and that's what matters.
I want to jump in. I could talk to you for hours. I wanted to touch on, and I recommend everyone read your book. It's a absolutely fantastic and comprehensive read, and frankly, I had to remind myself what grand strategy actually means as I was reading. But the other elements that we haven't talked about yet are, of course, the diplomacy piece, and you've mentioned a number of times, India. Recently, there was a visit from India, looking for some sort of, increased alliance. I don't think we can call India an ally at this point, but it looks like there's interest. That sounds like a good thing. Certainly, America has an interest, and I would argue should have an interest. And then, of course, there's the question of Russia, which is, I guess the other side of the coin, right? There's this limitless, to use the official jargon terminology, relationship between the CCP and Russia at the moment. So how do we deal with this?
Sure, and yeah, so in the diplomatic section, I basically broke it up into the alliance system as one pillar, then the emerging world is another, where China has its Belt and Road interests and its investment activities concentrated. I mean, we have to have strategies for those too, which I've laid out. But then the third being major powers, where I talked about India and Russia. And I think first of all, as somebody who did my PhD work in China-India relations, I mean, it's in a way exciting to see those two nations become, in many ways, the centerpiece of U.S. Foreign policy and strategic thinking, and to see the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Washington recently, and the fact that we are moving forward with what could be the most important relationship of the 21st century if we get it right. I mean, India is a very natural friend and partner to the United States on these issues. I mean, their sense of what's at stake with Beijing is pretty hard to beat. They understand it very well. Their border war in 1962, I think, redefined Indian foreign policy thinking, and what they need now. I mean, for me, a lot of this goes back to economics, of course, but if we can build a robust economic partnership where India is a $3.75 trillion economy today, if India can get to 10 trillion or so over time, I mean, whether that's this decade or early in the next one, I mean, that's going to be a pretty big economic counterweight and a good potentially demand-driven place in which to refocus corporate interests and business interests and refocus some investment decisions and supply chain decisions. I mean, we may have another center of gravity in Asia that really matters. And then there's the military side, where India's military geography is incredibly powerful in Asia. I mean, I had a Chinese think tank director back when I was a PhD student in southern China tell me the Indian Ocean is the part of the world that matters most to China because we'll depend on it for resources for the next 40 years. And of course, there's India, which is right at the center of it with fantastic maritime geography. And yet they have disadvantages in the Himalayas, which we could help them shore up. If they're able to successfully defend their Himalayan borders and at the same time project maritime power in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, which, as I write in the book, is correctly understood as the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that's really the geopolitical center of gravity here. So I think we have a lot of great work ahead of us with India. A lot of economic work, a lot of diplomatic work, and certainly a lot of military partnership. And then also, I think, in some ways adds an enormous heft to our alliance system, which is principally composed of highly industrial economies in Europe and Asia. But you start to bring India into it, and they're a voice in the emerging world. And that's not to say that India necessarily wants to be a treaty ally or would be a treaty ally, but if our interests in are aligned enough and our partnership is deep and strong enough and our understanding is large, then I think you start to see the free world take on a very new meaning in much of the world, and that could be a great benefit to everyone. And then when it comes to Russia, I mean, that's I think a moment that we're all witnessing now is on one level, the Russia-China axis, and I do think it's very similar to the early Sino-Soviet alliance, and I nearly did my PhD work in Russian and Chinese nationalism during the Sino-Soviet split, so I had to spend quite a bit of time on that one too. But they've been working together since the 2010s, certainly, when Putin first invaded Ukraine and then seized Crimea, and China built the military islands in the South China Sea, and the fact that Xi and Putin have met over 40 times, that they have regular military exercises, air, land, and sea. I mean, it's a pretty robust partnership, and I think if without partners in Moscow, Beijing is playing a pretty lonely game against the United States. So I think it's actually a very significant partnership for both sides, insofar as they seek to probe or even overturn American power. But in the long run, I don't think it will last. It is something that's going to put Russia at such a significant disadvantage over time. I mean, that's already starting. For them to have destroyed their relations with the West and to rely on China essentially as the only real partner for them is a terrible geopolitical position. So if we ever wind up in a Russia that does not look like Putin's Russia, or whatever might be similar to him waiting in the wings, if we ever get past that and towards a more Russia that would want to rebalance the world, and I don't think that's possible in the 2020s, but as this contest goes on in the 2030s or beyond, it is possible to have a second Russia-China split that's like the first one in the Cold War, where in this case they might want to pull back from this bet on China that is likely to be very bad for them in the long run. And the only thing that I think we need to focus on in the meantime, other than the strategies we're executing towards Russia already, is to focus on the Russia-China economic relationship, and the fact that even as many American companies left Russia after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese companies stayed in, and they're building that relationship. I mean, they're really cementing it together across technology and energy, even finance to some degree. And we should be, preparing to sanction and otherwise go after the Chinese companies that are enabling Putin's invasion of Ukraine and that are cementing and building the Russia-China relationship. I think if we're taking those actions in the 2020s, then it becomes a more porous and malleable relationship in the long run.
But I do have to comment on this. Russia faced, I guess, the entirety of the U.S. sanction system, right? That it was possible to engage, but that turned out to be kind of, use the word porous, that turned out to be kind of porous. I mean, even India is buying oil from Russia, which is, very kind of a key revenue stream for them. It was very difficult to actually enact that entirely, and partially, of course, because of China too. But it made me wonder about the strength of the U.S. kind of, economic warfare, so to speak, when I saw that how porous it actually was, or was this because of, some kind of lobbying dollars? I don't know. I don't know what the reason. Do you have a beat on why that has not been as effective as it might have been?
Well, I think it has been effective in certain ways. I mean, cutting major Russian banks off from the financial system. I mean, having an exodus of American and allied corporations out of Russia. I mean, it absolutely, destabilized the currency. It definitely hurt their economic growth, put it into recession. They're having trouble gaining parts with which to continue to, wage their invasion of Ukraine. But the fact that China is an economic backstop to Russia, that I think is if anything the most significant part. That they really are. I mean, this invasion of Ukraine is being, financed, and essentially the economic power behind it is not in Russia. It's the fact that they have this external market in the People's Republic of China, where they were not responding to what we're really trying to achieve there. So the U.S. and the allied countries could put sanctions on there, but they knew, I think, pretty clearly that they'd have China's economic support. So that's been an offset for them. And again, I think it's not necessarily about sanctions to change intent so much as sanctions to change capability. And there's a lot that can be done, I think, with U.S. sanctions. And the most significant lessons from how they've been applied to Russia is just that they can be applied to a very large economy. I think we're going to learn a lot from that that may be very useful when it comes to shaping China's capabilities in certain industries and overall.
I want to touch on the military piece because we are going to have to finish up shortly. And this is the area that I'm the least familiar with. One thing I know for sure is that Chinese military spending, the CCP's military spending has been going up considerably. They're building, huge navy. And there's this huge depletion of U.S. Ammunition stocks and so forth in Ukraine. So, this peace through strength model seems to be kind of coming apart a bit, even as you're advocating for it. Would you read it that way?
Well, look, I mean, a whole lot of what needs to be done here is to make sure that we have a first-tier, broad-spectrum industrial base. I mean, that's absolutely a necessity, and I think that's something we're going to have to realize as a country. I mean, there have been a lot of studies of American manufacturing power, what can be done, both from a policy standpoint and from a business standpoint. I think it's a sector that we could, do quite a lot to revitalize or certainly reimagine and do that. I mean, it could create a lot of jobs. It could create a lot of real opportunities and a lot of national security benefits from purely economic, things such as supply chain security to also the fact that to be the arsenal of democracy, you are going to have an industrial base. And that's just something that we have to make a number one priority in this country. I think we're already hearing a lot of talk about that, and it just has to get done. So being able to do that, both in terms of military systems, but to have the broader general industrial base to sustain that. When I talk to historians of the Second World War and they tell me how many miles of copper wire it took to build, a bomber, let's say. I mean, it was a much broader industrial base that we could draw on in times of absolute crisis. And I think for now, to be able to wage peace through strength to prevent war by being prepared and being something that one does not want to fight against if you're in the adversary's shoes. A lot of that will come from revitalizing American manufacturing and industrial power. And I think that's been studied well and it needs to be executed.
Right. Well, a lot does come back to that. So is this sort of was this the most effective, Chinese Communist Party method of warfare, is to pull such a huge chunk of industry out from the U.S. into itself?
Well, I think the irony there is that it really took two to tango in that situation. I mean, it was an American general idea of what it meant to have China rise, where we had, I think, some optimism about it. We had some, I think, false hopes about it. I mean, certainly the idea that the famous line, of course, is that as China grew rich, it would become a responsible stakeholder, was the quote. And there are many, many people that said that and believed that. And I think even now, as we realize that that's not the case, that was the intent, as far as I understand it, for multiple decades of American policy. And it just didn't bear out. And it's something that we still can address, and it's something that we still can change. And I think that's why I've talked about this as the decisive decade, is it's a decade when we still have very substantial advantages over our adversaries, and we simply need to maintain those advantages, reduce our adversaries' access to us and to our allies. We can't do this alone. It's going to have to be an alliance system-wide effort. And at that point, you create a new advantage, and you don't let them surpass us. And surpassing us has been their dream since Mao Zedong talked about it in the 1950s. But this is the decade where we make sure that never happens.
As we finish up, I want to get back to this sort of realm of ideas, okay? I think some of the most effective tools of warfare that the CCP has waged against the free world, especially America, is the information warfare and this kind of demoralization that we often see. And, America is bad. Again, this is for different reasons across the political spectrum. It's kind of astounding to me. You really need to have that sort of outside perspective to say, oh, wait a second, compared to what, right? Bad compared to what? I feel like it's been, even in the foreign policy establishment, right? I mean, the Thucydides trap, this is something that's been talked about for a while since the book was written. China's the ascendant power. The U.S. is the declining power. It's almost, but what I realized after a while is that people started just believing this is a foregone conclusion. That's also an aspect of demoralization. And of course, the propaganda has been, sort of supporting all this, all the moral failings, every moral failing, and some of them considerable, amplified. Yes, America's bad, and don't talk about us very much. You shouldn't do that, right? So How do we deal with that in the end? I keep coming back to this, right? But I feel like if we don't deal with that, we can't get around the American idea. You know, how can we win this, really?
Well, I think it's two things. One, we have to understand very clearly what the Communist Party of China really represents. I mean, it's human rights atrocities, the fact that it, you know, is the organization that's responsible for the most, you know, deaths in history. I mean, Mao Zedong presided over something like 40 million deaths in his own country. They fought wars against most of their neighbors. I mean, they fought us in the Korean War, and they fought the entire United Nations, and you know, carrying out a genocide today. I mean, all these things that I think are easily knowable, that we need to really be, you know, sort of have a clearer understanding of, and just recognize that that's part of what we're dealing with here in terms of the consequences of this contest, and then also realizing that the United States, you know, is to some extent a quest for perfection. I understand that that's part of how we see ourselves as a nation, as a work in progress, as one that, you know, can do better, can go farther, can be a greater force for good. But, you know, we have to understand that geopolitically, to lose a major strategic contest to a place that, you know, seeks to dismantle all the features of a democratic or rights-based system, that is a very big difference in how history works. And we've been very lucky that it was the United States that won the Second World War, and that it was the United States that won the Cold War. And I think we have to remember that that is just one of the most important things in modern history, is who won those contests. And we're headed into something where I think the stakes are similar. There's still a chance to win in a peacetime way, but we have to have confidence in ourselves that it is not over, that we can do this, and that it matters that we do come through on this one. I mean, it matters just as much as anything before. And I think we'll learn that either because we start to think clearly about what's at stake, or we'll learn it the hard way. But I'd much rather have us come to that before it's too late.
Well, Jonathan Ward, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Well, thank you, Jan. Great to be with you.
Thank you all for joining Jonathan Ward and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.
Fundamentally, they depend more on us